At 76, King Charles shattered decades of silence with just one sentence: "She was the love of my life." The world stood still. For over half a century, the narrative had been tightly guarded, masterfully controlled, and obsessively analyzed. And yet, with those few words, he upended it all. This wasn't a tribute to Camilla, the woman who stood beside him through scandal and succession. No, this was something far more raw, an unexpected confession drenched in longing, regret, and emotional vulnerability. For the first time, the man groomed from birth to become king allowed his crown to slip, revealing the soul of someone who had loved, and perhaps lost more deeply than anyone ever knew. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Charles had spent his entire life choosing duty over desire, tradition over truth. The monarchy demands silence, stability, and sacrifice. And for years, he gave it all: every smile at a balcony appearance, every wave, every handshake, meticulously polished by generations of protocol. Love? That was secondary. Or at least, that's what the world was told. The romantic arc assigned to him had been tightly scripted. Camilla was the constant, Diana the complication. Camilla was the woman he waited for. Diana was the woman who changed everything. But this confession delivered not with royal pomp, but with the weary breath of a man nearing the twilight of his life, forced a piercing question. Had we misunderstood it all? Because in that single line, everything has shifted. She was the love of my life. Not my wife. Not my partner. Not the queen. Just she. Deliberate. Haunting. A sentence that dripped with unspoken truth. The identity was implied, but unmistakable. Diana. The woman he had once stood beside at the altar. The woman he had shared 2 children with. The woman whose death shocked the world and stained the crown. For decades, Charles had spoken about her with caution, always wrapped in royal phrasing. But now, the mask had finally cracked. This wasn't just a moment of reflection, it was a reckoning. One that exposed the fragile human buried beneath royal armor. What happens when a man trained to hide everything finally admits the one thing that matters most? His words did more than stir emotions, they reopened history's deepest wounds. The love triangle we thought we understood was never that. Simple. And suddenly, everything the world had assumed about Charles, Diana, and Camilla was unraveling. Why now? Why, after so many years, did Charles finally speak? Was it guilt? A desperate attempt to set the record straight before it's too late? Or was it the purest form of regret, the kind that only grows louder with age? Because sometimes, the heart waits until the world grows quiet to finally scream its truth. And Charles, the once silent prince, now king, had finally screamed his. But to understand the weight of this confession, we must go back to where it all began. Their story didn't begin with love at first sight. It began with someone else entirely. In the autumn of 1977, Prince Charles arrived at Althorp House with his attention fixed on Lady Sarah Spencer, the poised, confident older sister of a girl who lingered quietly on the edges. Diana was just 16, shy, observant, still untouched by the public eye or the weight of royal expectation. She was not the woman the world would come to know. Not yet the tragic icon or the adored Princess of Wales. She was simply the youngest daughter in a noble household, her voice soft, her presence almost invisible. But even in that passing moment, something stirred. Charles may not have understood it at the time, but the quiet girl in the background had left an imprint, a faint one, yet one he wouldn't forget. At the time, Charles was in his late 20s, already burdened by whispers of duty and dynastic pressure. The clock was ticking. The world was watching, and his bachelorhood, increasingly scrutinized, was becoming a national conversation. Sarah, charming and well-connected, seemed like a suitable match on paper. Their short-lived romance followed the familiar path of royal flirtation, polite, strategic, unremarkable. But fate had other plans. Because while Charles was preoccupied with Sarah, Diana remained in the margins, unnoticed by the public, yet quietly unforgettable. Something about her stayed with him, not attraction, not romance, not yet, but a peculiar feeling of curiosity, the kind that lingers long after a moment has passed. Diana, too, remembered. Though young and impressionable, she had been struck by Charles's presence, his royal stature, his conversation, and the aura that surrounded him. To her, he was not just a prince, but a symbol of something far removed from her quiet world. Their interaction was brief, barely enough to call a beginning. Yet it was enough to mark the first flicker of a story that would one day capture and shatter the hearts of millions. Charles stood waiting, his figure regal and composed, but his posture was stiff, his eyes distant. There was no warmth in his gaze, no spark of shared joy. Observers brushed it off as nerves, but for those who knew the couple intimately, it was something far more chilling, an emotional chasm that ceremony alone could not close. The cracks showed in subtle but powerful ways. Diana accidentally reversed the order of Charles's names during the vows, a harmless mistake on the surface. But to many, it symbolized how unfamiliar they truly were. Then came Charles's quiet decision to omit the promise to obey his wife, breaking with royal tradition. To some, it was progressive. To others, it was a quiet rejection of submission in a marriage already built on imbalance. These weren't just moments. They were signals, clues that the fairy tale unfolding on screens worldwide was, in fact, a carefully staged illusion. What the public couldn't see was the emotional toll playing out behind palace walls. Diana later revealed that even on her wedding day, she felt profoundly alone. She had already discovered the whispers of another woman, Camilla, and yet there she was, committing her life to a man whose heart may have never truly been hers. The very pageantry meant to elevate her now felt like a cage. Amid applause and celebration, she stood as the most adored woman in the world and the most isolated. As they rode back in the royal carriage and waved to a euphoric crowd, the illusion of love continued to shimmer. The world saw magic, but Diana saw a future already collapsing under the weight of expectation, secrecy, and sacrifice. And while the balcony kiss would seal the public's fantasy, it would do nothing to ease the dread tightening in her chest. This wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of a performance that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. As the royal couple settled into married life, a new challenge emerged: parenthood. 2 sons, 1 fragile marriage. Could children save a union built on tradition, not love? In 1982, the birth of Prince William marked what many believed was the turning point for Charles and Diana. For a brief moment, the cold air between them seemed to warm. The image of Charles gently placing his hand on Diana's back as they stood outside St. Mary's Hospital felt almost tender, almost real. Diana beamed with genuine joy, her arms cradling the child she already loved more than anything else. The world watched with renewed hope. Perhaps parenthood would bind them in ways love could not. But behind the flashes of the cameras, the cracks in their relationship only deepened. Diana immersed herself in motherhood with the intensity of someone trying to protect what little joy she could still call her own. She wasn't just a mother. She became a shield, a haven, a constant in a world of royal protocol and emotional detachment. Her love for William wasn't strategic or performative. It was raw, immediate, and all-consuming. Charles, on the other hand, remained locked within the confines of his upbringing. Raised in a monarchy that valued duty over emotion, he struggled to mirror Diana's openness. His affection came in fragments: a formal nod, a polite comment, a hand briefly placed. It was there, but always restrained, filtered through generations of royal stoicism. Then came 1984. Prince Harry was born, and Diana, once again, gave herself fully to the role of mother. But the joy of this moment was quickly overshadowed by a reaction that pierced deeper than she expected. Charles had hoped for a girl. Instead, he joked about Harry's red hair, a remark that Diana never forgot. To her, it wasn't just a comment, it was a confirmation. No matter how many children they had, no matter how perfectly she fulfilled her royal role, she would never be enough to win his full affection. The children, instead of stitching them closer, became mirrors reflecting just how differently they viewed the world. Their parenting styles collided with quiet violence. Diana brought the boys to amusement parks, hugged them freely, knelt to their level, and listened. She wanted them to grow up with warmth, something she had learned to create out of the coldness surrounding her. Charles, meanwhile, leaned on tradition. He preferred structure, discipline, and distance. To him, love was expressed in duty. To Diana, love meant presence, affection, and vulnerability. And in that clash, something broke. Parenthood, far from healing their wounds, only made them more visible. The joy of watching their sons grow was undercut by the growing emotional distance between them. Diana tried to hold the family together, pouring herself into her sons the way Charles could never pour himself into her. The palace presented a polished version of parenthood to the public, but behind closed doors, they were two parents in parallel worlds. And while Diana poured her heart into motherhood, Charles's heart was drifting elsewhere. She was never meant to be queen, but she always had his heart. Long before Diana, before the wedding watched by millions, and before the monarchy found itself caught in the storm of modern scandal, there was Camilla. In 1970, at a polo match that history would later view with sharpened hindsight, Prince Charles met Camilla Shand. The connection was instant. It wasn't fiery or chaotic, it was comfortable, familiar. She laughed at his jokes, challenged his thoughts, and saw him not as a future king, but as a man. For Charles, constantly surrounded by protocol and expectation, this wasn't just rare, it was intoxicating, but the timing was never on their side. When Charles left for naval duty in 1971, the bond they had formed began to stretch, then fray. Camilla, pragmatic and grounded in reality, didn't wait. In 1973, she married Andrew Parker Bowles, a decision that shattered whatever dream Charles had been quietly nurturing. Friends said he was devastated. Those closest to him claimed he felt something slip away, something irreplaceable. And yet, the connection never truly died. Letters continued. Glances lingered. Even as their lives moved in separate directions, emotionally, they never quite let go. By the mid-1980s, the flame had reignited quietly at first, under the guise of friendship. But behind palace walls, and in whispered phone calls, it became clear this was something deeper, something both forbidden and undeniable. Charles was now married to Diana, and the world had crowned them as the face of modern royalty. But behind closed doors, the emotional distance between them had become a chasm. Camilla, once the past, was now his escape. She understood him. She expected nothing. And in her presence, he felt seen. While the world obsessed over the royal fairy tale, Charles was writing a secret chapter in the shadows. Diana, however, was never blind. She felt the glances, the whispers, the unspoken truths that hovered between them. And in 1989, she confronted Camilla in a moment of extraordinary bravery. At a birthday party, surrounded by friends and royalty, Diana approached her husband's mistress and said the words that would echo through history. "I know what's going on between you and Charles. I just want you to know that." It wasn't rage, it was resolved. But the confrontation didn't end the affair. If anything, it solidified the triangle. One woman publicly beloved, the others were privately cherished, and a prince torn between two lives. Then came the interview that changed everything. In 1995, Diana sat down with BBC's Panorama and said the line that shattered the palace's carefully crafted illusion. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. With that one sentence, she pulled back the curtain on the monarchy's most closely guarded secret. The affair was no longer speculation, it was the truth. A truth that had been hidden, denied, and finally exposed. The public was stunned. Sympathy flooded toward Diana. Charles, long seen as the reserved prince, now stood at the center of a betrayal that redefined the monarchy's image. And yet, despite the backlash, despite the chaos, Camilla remained. She became Charles's refuge, his emotional safe space. But at what cost? The woman he was expected to love had been cast aside. The woman he had always loved remained in the shadows. Camilla was not Diana. She didn't captivate the world or redefine royal motherhood, but she offered Charles what no one else could: consistency, familiarity, peace. Still, the damage had been done. The illusion of a united royal family had collapsed. The trust of the public had been shaken. As love triangles turned into battle lines, the end of a royal marriage was inevitable. In death, she said what he never could, and in grief, he finally showed what he always felt. On the night of August 31, 1997, the world was jolted awake by the unthinkable. Princess Diana was gone. A car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris claimed her life, and with it, shattered the illusion that the royal story could ever return to normal. The woman once mocked by palace insiders as too emotional, the same woman cast out from royal life, became in an instant the soul of a grieving nation. Candles flickered outside Kensington Palace, flowers stacked by the thousands. Grown, men wept in the streets. The monarchy, silent, composed and cold, was now caught in the glare of a different kind of spotlight. And at the center of it all stood Charles. To many, he was the villain of the story. The man who had betrayed her. The one who had remained emotionally distant through her suffering. And now, in her death, seemed a symbol of everything she had fought against. The royal family's initial silence fueled the rage. There were no statements, no lowered flags, no tears were shown publicly. But behind the palace gates, away from the cameras and the judgment, something unexpected happened. Something the public rarely saw. Charles made a decision that broke with royal precedent. He insisted on bringing her body home himself. He didn't send a delegate. He didn't delegate the grief. He went. To many insiders, it was a moment of reckoning. A man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind protocol now acted with defiant humanity. On that flight back from Paris, he wasn't the heir to the throne, he was the father of her children. The man who had once been her partner, however imperfectly. In silence, he sat with her body. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, but it was perhaps the only time Charles ever let the world see that Diana had never been just a duty. And that silence, it spoke volumes. For years, he had struggled to express what Diana seemed to do so naturally: emotion, vulnerability, connection. In her absence, those very qualities echoed louder than ever before. Charles found himself confronting a legacy he hadn't fully understood until it was too late. Diana's warmth, her spontaneity, her undeniable bond with the public, these were not flaws, they were gifts. And suddenly, they became everything he had never been allowed to be. While the Queen remained a symbol of unshaken tradition, Charles began to shift slowly, awkwardly, but noticeably. In quiet interviews, he mentioned Diana with a tenderness that hadn't existed during their marriage. In private, he admired the impact she had left on their sons, the public, and yes, even him. Her defiance had once embarrassed the monarchy. Now, it softened it. And though he never said it outright in those early years, the grief clung to him like an unanswered question. Had he ever truly understood what he lost? Every flower laid at the palace gate became a quiet indictment. Every tear from a stranger was a mirror reflecting his silence. But grief has a way of forcing truth to the surface. And in the absence of words, Charles's gestures became his language. His insistence on flying to Paris, his rare show of vulnerability during the public mourning, his attempts, however clumsy, to connect with his sons as Diana once did. These were not grand redemptions, but they were real. Years passed, wounds faded, but one truth never did. And now it has finally surfaced. After decades of silence, King Charles finally whispered the words that history was waiting for. At 76 years old, a man once defined by restraint and tradition allowed himself to say what he had never dared say in the light of duty. She was the love of my life. Just 7 words, quiet, unannounced, and almost too late. But in those 7 words, an entire legacy shifted. The world paused. The air around the monarchy thickened, not because of the shock, but because of the heartbreak everyone had long suspected and never heard confirmed. Why now? After a lifetime of silence, stoicism, rehearsed remarks, and carefully worded tributes, what made this moment different? Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the realization that time no longer stretched endlessly before him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the weight of living too long with an unsaid truth. For decades, he had played the part of an heir, of husband, of father, and finally, of king. But rarely had he played the part of the man he truly was, one torn between what was expected of him and what his heart had always known. Camilla, his constant, remained by his side, the woman he was allowed to love, who had waited in the shadows for years, then walked into the spotlight as queen consort. She gave him stability, familiarity, and peace. But Diana gave him something else entirely. She gave him chaos and fire. She gave him a mirror he didn't always want to look into. She gave him the kind of love that disrupts legacy. And for that, she was both adored and feared. Camilla represented private comfort. Diana embodied public love. One offered safety. The other left a mark on the world. The confession didn't close a chapter. It reopened a wound. Old questions returned, with new intensity. Was Diana his greatest regret? Did he only realize her value when she was gone? Did duty silence a heart that, in another life, might have chosen differently? In those final words, there was no anger, just sorrow. The sorrow of a man who had gained everything and still lost something he never fully understood, until it was no longer his to hold. And yet, the world responded not with rage, but with something softer. Sympathy, reflection, a strange kind of peace. Because we all know that love isn't always tidy. It doesn't always arrive at the right time or in the right form. Sometimes, the love that shapes you most is the one that doesn't stay. And that's what Diana became, not just a memory, but a symbol of what might have been, of what was too good for the world they lived in, and of what, despite every royal barrier, still managed to reach across decades and silence. The difference between who we love and who we're permitted to love can shape an entire life. And Charles's life, for all its privilege and power, was never free from that divide. His confession wasn't just about Diana, it was about every word he didn't say when it mattered. And in saying it now, he gave the world one final aching truth. Because in the end, even kings carry regrets, and some loves are too great to forget. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.